allow him to tell the story and introduce the rest of the people as he progresses through telling the story. So thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, and we all appreciate it, and thank you all for this opportunity for us as well. Okay, picture it. Germany, August 1939. The world sits on the eve of a Second World War. Jews are trying to escape their homeland and find safety in neighboring countries and around the world. 17-year-old Esther Berkowitz and her 10-year-old brother, Nat, lived in Berlin with their parents. The family ran a successful men's and boys' clothing store, worked hard, and had a good life. Though that life, like so many other Jewish people, deteriorated as Hitler's power rose. However, thanks to a special ruling allowing children to emigrate on an expedited basis, Esther and Nat were to leave for America and stay with family until their parents could acquire visas at a later date. Esther and Nat's parents brought them from Berlin to Hamburg to make the voyage on the Hansa, a Hamburg American ocean liner. For the Jews on board, it was a journey sailing from Nazi oppression. Once the ship left Germany, the mood on the ship was one of joy, relief, and celebration. On ship, Esther befriended a 20-year-old non-Jewish German man whose name we would later find out was George. The ship was to make a scheduled stop in Southampton, England, before making its way to New York. As timing would have it, as the ship approached Southampton Harbor, it made a sharp U-turn, and the crew started scurrying around, sealing up windows, much to the bewilderment of the passengers and the people on the tender preparing to board the ship. You see, at that moment, on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, officially starting World War II. And since England was an ally of Poland, the ship could be considered an enemy located in English waters. To escape that danger, sadly, the ship and its passengers were now headed back to Nazi Germany. 2 days later, the United Kingdom and France declared war on Germany. When the unscheduled liner arrived in Hamburg Harbor, there was absolute chaos. At this time, Jews could no longer stay in a regular hotel as they were restricted, and the Jews from the ship were being gathered to be transported to a location outside of the city. As it turns out, George had his uncle's luxury automobile on board, which he had intended to sell in the United States as a means of getting money out of Germany. While on the docks, he noticed Esther and Nat, whom he befriended on board. Traveling alone, they looked bewildered and frightened in the indescribable pandemonium. No one was helping them or even paying attention to them. By this time, the military had taken over all transportation, and there was no way for them to get back to Berlin. He realized that without money and help, they would be left to a precarious fate. He made the quick decision to drive them home to Berlin, the opposite direction of the German-Dutch border, where he then planned to cross and drive to France, where he would board another ship to the United States. The decision changed their lives and his by ultimately missing the chance to get out of Germany. Putting himself in danger by transporting Jews, he drove through the night from Hamburg back to Berlin. Oddly, the car was able to pass through military checkpoints, thereby avoiding the need for Esther and Nat to identify as Jewish. Nat often recalled how amazing this was and wondered, who is he? Is he a diplomat? Why is he getting through and nobody else? As it turns out, the export plates on George's car allowed him to pass without stopping. Esther and Nat were delivered safely to their parents at 4 a.m., though instead of leaving Berlin immediately, George stayed to try and see Esther again. Of course, she couldn't say no to this kind man, but didn't want to give him the wrong impression. So she made up to meet him at a local park and brought her mother as a chaperone. After that, they didn't see each other again. Approximately 6 weeks later, Esther and Nat were booked on a Dutch ship out of Belgium. However, at the German-Belgian border, Nazis removed Esther and Nat's father from the train. You see, he was born in Poland, and Jews were not permitted to receive German citizenship despite his living in the country for years. Being considered a Polish citizen, he could not be allowed to leave the country where he could potentially fight for Poland. But he told his wife to save the children. Their mom got Esther and Nat safely on the ship, but instead of going to England, where she had a visa, she returned to Germany to try and help rescue her husband. She was unsuccessful and eventually captured and died in transport on the way to Auschwitz. However, news of both of their deaths was not known until years later. Esther and Nat went on to start a new life. Esther helping raise Nat as a surrogate mom. Esther worked in a factory, and both went to school to learn a new language. Both were married, each raised 2 children, leading to multiple grandchildren and great-grandchildren. They ran a successful business in Manhattan together with their spouses, and even lived within a few blocks of each other for over 30 years in Howard Beach, New York, where they were all very active in their synagogue. Nat even recorded his personal story for Steven Spielberg's Survivors of the Shoah Foundation, and tells the story of his escape, including the night drive from Berlin by the man whose name they didn't know or couldn't remember. Though Esther and Nat had always wondered, what had happened to the fate of that man who saved them? Okay, now you may think this is where the story ends, but there's more. In 2010, Nat received an unexpected call from the Holocaust Museum. Nat was asked, "Are you Nathan Berkowitz?" "Yes," he replied. "Do you have a sister, Esther Berkowitz?" "Yes." "Well," said the man, "there's somebody who's been looking for you for 71 years. It was then that the lost connection was made between Esther and Nat, and that nameless man who drove them with them to Berlin. They then learned that the man's name was George Wittenstein. It was George's 91st birthday when they had their first encounter with the Berkowitzes, a deeply emotional one, and a discussion ensued for the Berkowitz family, the Berkowitzes and their families, to fly to Santa Barbara to meet. In August 2010, the 3 of them met once again for an emotional reunion. The people here on this stage, who I'll introduce a little later, some in the audience and some who are not here today but around the country, all went with them for that very important event. I have to tell you, it was an amazing experience seeing all of them meet again for the first time in 71 years, sharing history of their lives and more. It was really a moment you think only exists in the movies or somewhere on a stage, but this was real. George had questions for Esther and Nat, and they had questions for him. The missing links had now been chained together. George even presented my grandmother with a photo of her he had taken on the ship before it had turned around. That's this one here. A dreamy look as she lay on a deck chair, heading for a new country. It was unbelievable to see a photo of her that we never knew existed, and that George kept all those years. You got it. There are many things we also learned during our trip. First, George's mother was on that tender in Southampton Harbor, waiting to meet her son on board and travel together to America. Also, since George didn't leave Germany right away, he missed his opportunity to emigrate to America. George spent the war as a soldier in medical school and on the Russian and Italian fronts where he was wounded. Sounds familiar, right? He became a core member of the resistance group, the White Rose, and took what became the most iconic photo of that group, which is on this stage right behind me. As well as nearly all the photos taken for White Rose Publications, and which have since been used in historical films and exhibits on the subject. 5 of his friends, including his PhD advisor, were all executed. In addition, he belonged to the resistance group Freedom Action Bavaria, which carried out the only successful military push against Hitler, saving Munich from complete destruction. While serving at these fronts, he collected weapons from the wounded on whom he operated, and then smuggled those to the Freedom Action Bavaria group in Munich. The tragic demise of the White Rose is well known and shared here on stage today, triggered by the arrests of Hans Scholl and his sister Sophie as they distributed those leaflets in 1943. The Scholls were executed. Alerted to the trial by a friend, George was able to bring the Scholls' parents to the Palace of Justice, where they were able to see their children alive one last time. George also delivered other messages from White Rose captors to their families. While interrogated by both the Gestapo and the military court in 1944, George was miraculously able to disprove their accusations. After arriving in the United States, George continued his surgical training at Harvard and at the Universities of Rochester and Colorado. He married his wife Elizabeth and had 4 children. The 4 moved to Santa Barbara in 1960, where George practiced medicine for an additional 35 years. After Elizabeth's untimely death in 1966, he married Christabel Jenke, an anesthesiologist who helped him raise his 4 young children. Despite being haunted by flashbacks and nightmares, George felt he had to contribute what he knew and give equal voice and respect to all those who had done so much and given their lives. He inspired countless students during classroom visits to schools and colleges, and by giving lectures about the White Rose. Though George had always wondered what had happened to the fate of the brother and sister he helped save. He wanted to know what happened to the entire family. It haunted him for years, not knowing. His wife, Krista, wanted to help her husband find some peace. She had the idea that their names might be on the passenger manifest for the ship. She contacted the shipping line to acquire the records, and ultimately was able to receive the list and review it. George only knew Esther's first name, and when searching the list, she came across the name Air Fraulein Esther Berkowitz traveling with a young man of the same last name. They determined this must be them, and looked to the Holocaust Museum to help locate them. Initially, with no luck. Ultimately, through other means, an intern at the museum named Jordan Somers helped make the connection. Jordan also joined us in Santa Barbara as well for that reunion. When later asked why he risked his life repeatedly, George was always surprised at the question, and he would answer, someone had to do it. He lived his entire life according to that principle. And as you know, that's the name of our talk here with you today. Lastly, of prime importance to my great uncle Nat is that the family continue to tell the story. And that's what we're doing here with you today, paying tribute to our family and to a well-deserving man. Before I go into my final words, I just want to introduce the people on this stage who are